We all grow up loving stories of heroes. From Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings, X-Men, the Avengers, Harry Potter, characters like Joe Marsh in Little Women, Cecily from Color Purple, and Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird. Heroes offer us examples of people who overcame enormous adversity, captivating visions that inspire us and that we can aspire to, and powerful pictures of how to live our lives in the present. Scholar of mythology Joseph Campbell once wrote that in every epic story of adventure, a hero ventures forth from the world of the common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered and a decisive victory is won. And then the hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on the rest of humanity. As we move into the 6th month of this pandemic, we are in desperate need of heroes. Back in April, I cautioned our staff to pace themselves, as I believed that the pandemic would be more like a marathon than a sprint. I was worried that we'd respond to the crisis with a flurry of activity and run out of energy over the long haul as things prolonged for many months. What I did not know then was that this pandemic is not a marathon or even an ultra-marathon. It's a long pilgrimage, a slog through the wilderness. In the article, America's Coronavirus Endurance Test, Howard Markle, a Johns Hopkins researcher who developed the concept of flattening the curve, wrote, "It's possible a vaccine will arrive this year, but many experts think it could be 2 years or even longer before a safe, effective shot has been developed, tested, manufactured, and made widely available. The challenge," he said, therefore, is not just flattening the curve, but keeping it flat and holding the line not for months, but for years. Years. That's right, he said years, and when I read it, I was horrified. The possibility that we may be facing this pandemic for years is objectively terrifying. So if we're going to make it through a long disaster, then we're going to have to start now developing incredible intestinal fortitude. We're going to have to learn the art of extraordinary endurance. We're going to have to cultivate the character of robust resilience. And where are we going to find the strength and the wherewithal to do this for a long time? What epic story of a hero's journey can we turn to for hope and forbearance to persevere through this historic crisis? I believe the story of the prophet Elijah's journey through the wilderness offers unseen resources for our resilience. Elijah prophesied during the corrupt and ruthless imperial dynasty of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, who worshipped the Canaanite fertility god Baal, and then moved the capital of Israel to Samaria, and then engaged in a large construction project to build a new temple, which devastated the ecological environment of the region and resulted in a horrific drought throughout the entire land. So Elijah began his ministry speaking truth to power and declaring to the king and queen that the environmental devastation, the drought, was a consequence of their greed, idolatry, and injustice. Elijah's first sermon was more like a weather report than a sermon, but King Ahab was not pleased with it either way. He deemed Elijah his enemy, an enemy of the state, and he named him the great troubler of the nation. And their contest reached its height on Mount Carmel, where Elijah competed against 450 of the king's false prophets and won a stunning and decisive victory. Afterwards, however, things turned quickly. Queen Jezebel sent Elijah a death threat, swearing to God that she would kill him in the next 24 hours. It's always scary when someone threatens to kill you, but it's far more terrifying when they tell you the time that they're going to do it. Scripture tells us that Elijah was so terrified by Jezebel's serious threat that he ran for his life into the wilderness. I find it striking that many of the strongest heroes in the Bible all end up in the wilderness at some point, Hagar, Moses, Elijah, and later Jesus. And at some point, they all wanted to die. The wilderness is a place where it feels like life has lost its meaning, where life and living feels worse than death. Elijah sat down, we're told, under a solitary broom tree and said, "Enough, God, take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." The feeling of futility filled him. It's no coincidence that when Jesus was being transfigured on the mountain, the two prophets who appeared with him were Moses and Elijah, the same two prophets who'd suffered death threats and depression and were attacked by their people and asked God to die. I wonder if that's any indication of the emotions Jesus was experiencing at that point in his ministry. No human being, not even Jesus, is immune to the threat of emotional and spiritual exhaustion. In our pride, we often say to ourselves that we will rest when we are dead. But even God, the creator of the universe, rested on the seventh day. Do we imagine that we are more powerful or more important than God? We do whenever we don't take time to rest. Elijah was so tired he fell asleep, and an angel had to wake him up twice to get Elijah to eat enough food and drink enough water to renew his strength. How did Elijah become so exhausted and depressed? There's an unspoken theme in this story that can only be uncovered as we read between the lines. Elijah had been working for far too long, for far too hard, and he had not taken any of the time he needed for his own renewal. Call it self-care or Sabbath, vacation, call it whatever you want. Elijah had not done it. And because he had not tended to his need for rest and rejuvenation, Elijah now found himself completely burnt out. After the greatest triumph of his life, suddenly Elijah was not only facing the end of his career, but the end of his very existence. All of the victories he had were outstanding, but he didn't take time to process what was happening in and around him and rest after the victory. And as a result, all that he had achieved was now at risk. Elijah was physically, emotionally, and spiritually exhausted, lost and burned out, and he didn't even know it. Many of us are completely exhausted right now, and we don't know why. Some blame it on the toll of never-ending Zoom meetings or the recurring bad nightly news. But recently I learned about the concept of allostatic load. Allostasis is the process that our bodies use to respond to stress and regain stability. Think of it like a rubber band. Stress stretches out our bodies and then we snap back to stability. But both the stress and the snapback require energy. And as this pandemic drags on, we're having a lot of stress over time. And then these repeated stretches and snaps physiologically and psychologically compound on each other. And that accumulation is called allostatic load. The damage on a body from being repeatedly exposed to stress over and over again. All of us are facing these stressful things that we often don't imagine are stressful. Isolation, uncertainty, loss. But isolation creates loneliness. Uncertainty creates anxiety. Loss creates grief. So that means that loneliness, anxiety, and grief are these three huge stressors in our lives stacking up on top of each other, compounding and creating an allostatic load that we are carrying. And it takes tremendous physical energy for our minds to process this trinity of stress. And that is why we are feeling exhausted all of the time and don't know why. We are not just exhausted, we are stressed out and loaded for bear. God didn't respond to Elijah's burnout by sending him on an all-expense-paid vacation, or telling him to binge Netflix for 8 hours, or even to spend some time with friends and family. God sent Elijah on a 40-day journey into the wilderness to recover his prophetic identity and to restore his soul, to renew his spirit. But the physical pilgrimage through the wilderness was only half the journey Elijah had to make. He had to also look at the lies that he was telling himself. He would have to journey also into the inner wilderness of his own heart. And this would be the more challenging journey. When Elijah finally arrived at Mount Horeb, the first thing he did was go into the cave and find comfort. But that is when suddenly the word of God came to him with a stunning question. Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? It's a piercing question, holy question. When God asks us, what are you doing here? Easy answers will not suffice. If we try to answer quickly, we'll only end up with trivial and shallow responses. Answering this question requires deep reflection and discernment. Elijah didn't take much time to think about his answer. He responded very quickly. He said, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, and the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, he said, and they are seeking my life to take it away. So much arrogance and despair in Elijah's response. He puffed up his own resume, blamed the Israelites for his problems, condemned the very people he was supposed to be serving. Most prideful and deluded of all, Elijah thought he was the only faithful person left in all of Israel, and that there was no hope for him or for his people. In his rapid-fire, puffed-up protestations, the prophet Elijah never answered God's question at all. It's almost as if Elijah didn't hear the question or stopped listening halfway through the question to formulate his own response. So God tried a different approach. He commanded Elijah to come out of the cave and stand on the edge of the mountain. So Elijah went out and stood at the entrance of the cave, and there was a great wind, so strong it split the mountains and broke rocks into pieces. But we are told that God was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake furiously shook the ground and the foundation beneath Elijah's feet. But we're told God was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a blazing fire destroying the landscape. But we are told that God was not in the fire. And then, after the fire, Kol Demama Deka. Kol Demama Deka. These Hebrew words. They're tantalizing and elusive. They playfully resist traditional interpretation and translation, as if they're almost meant not to be translated. As a child, I grew up hearing that it was a still small voice. The NRSV renders it a sound of sheer silence, as if they were listening to a lot of Simon and Garfunkel when they were translating. The beauty of the Hebrew is that it can be both of these can be true at the same time. I think of it as a paradox. I think of it more like a thin, silent word. God communicated, but it was through silence. God was not in the earthquake, wind, or fire. God was in the silence, speaking to Elijah without making a sound, and yet the silence there was deeper, more powerful, and more profound than any words could ever be. Elijah thought that all hope was lost, but God was always with him, as close to him as his own breath. The mystic Thomas Keating says that silence is God's first language, and everything else is poor translation. Mother Teresa was once being interviewed by a reporter from the New York Times who asked her, Mother Teresa, when you pray, what do you say to God? Mother Teresa replied, I don't say anything. I just listen. But the reporter was quick and immediately asked a follow-up question. She said, well, if all you do is listen when you pray, then what does God say? Mother Teresa smiled and said, God doesn't say anything either. God just listens. One scholar claims that in this story, God did not say anything to Elijah at all, but instead all God did was breathe. Just as God breathed into Adam's lungs at the beginning, creating life, and into that army, that Ezekiel on the battlefield, God breathed life and spirit back into Elijah's depleted heart, filling him with new hope, new energy, recreating him, offering him the chance to catch his breath, giving him back his spirit, and filling him with a second wind for the work ahead. God longs to speak to us in the holy language of silence and to breathe into us that life-giving spirit, to give us a second wind for the second half of this pandemic. The only problem is that as human beings, we have a really hard time taking the time for silence. Henry Nouwen reminds us that the word absurd is derived from the Latin word surdus, which means deaf, and Nouwen claims that we live lives of absurdity when we are unable to hear, when we fail to listen, and when we remain deaf to the voice that longs to speak to us from the silence. A life without silence, he says, is an absurd existence. Silence is a friend who claims us, which means that silence is that unseen resource for our resilience in the midst of this pandemic. We can only answer the question that God has asked us by recognizing the caves that we are already in. We may not have laid the foundations or carved the walls that separate us, but by standing in the cave unmoved, we become complicit in their very existence. It's impossible to hear God in our caves. We must come out and escape the echo chamber, come out of hiding and step out to the edge of the mountain like Elijah, to feel the sting of the wind and hear the clap of the thunder and to feel the heat of the fire, and let the silence speak to us as we try to answer that holy question: what are you doing here? What are you doing here in this life? Surprisingly, when God asked Elijah that question all over again a second time, Elijah had the same response. He still hadn't learned the lesson yet. Like all of us, Elijah was hard of hearing and slow on the uptake. It would take him time to come to understand. But God was patient with Elijah, and God is patient with us. God did not get angry or frustrated with Elijah's inability to comprehend. God simply said, go back through the wilderness. God gave Elijah instructions to anoint Hazael as king of Aram, Nimshi as king of Israel, and Elijah as the prophet to take your place. With these words, God was challenging two of the fundamental lies that Elijah had told himself in his epic exhaustion and frustration. God did not tell Elijah, get out of your funk, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, stop feeling sorry for else, put an end to your pity party. No, Elijah's loneliness and anxiety and grief were very real. But there were also two lies that Elijah was telling himself, and God cut through the lies and proclaimed, you are not the only one left, Elijah. And this is not the end. You are not alone, Elijah. And there will always be hope. God said, yes, Elijah, yes, you've been zealous, but you're not the only person. There's help out there. There's Hazael and Nimshi and Elisha. They're there to help you. I have others who are faithful. God said, yes, Israel has forsaken the covenant, but it is not the time for you to retire. It is not the time for you to die. You are not alone, and you are not hopeless. I am the God of new beginnings and new creation. There are others who are faithful, and I have more work for you to do with them and a future for you to build. Heroic individualistic conceptions of resilience will not get us through a pandemic of loneliness, anxiety, and grief. We will need each other. The allostatic load of loneliness, anxiety, and grief cannot be overcome by a single person heroically operating in a vacuum if we're going to make it through this pandemic. And I believe we will make it through. We're going to need each other to survive and thrive, to endure and to persevere. Our deep need for one another is the first thing we felt that we lost and started missing when the pandemic hit, and it's the only thing, that feeling, that will get us through the crisis. When the fog of despair is thick around us, we can lose the ability to see all the resources that are already in our lives, but we have God here with us. We have the healing power of silence as close to us as our own breath, and we have each other if we are willing to reach out and to look and to open our eyes. Whenever we're feeling lost and exhausted, carrying this allostatic load of stress, God longs to speak to us in the silence as God spoke to Elijah to tell us, you are not the only one left. You are not alone, even if it feels like you are alone. You are not alone, and you already have everything you need to survive this crisis. Wendell Berry once wrote in a poem, "We pray not for a new heaven or a new earth, but to be quiet in heart and in eye clear. What we need is here." What we need is already here. It's already within us. It's already available to us. New power, new energy, new life, and new creation are waiting for us in the silence. The question is, will we take the time to stop and to do the work and to listen? If we do, God will reveal to us the unseen resources for our resilience and breathe the spirit of new life into our lungs. And if we don't, God will patiently just continue to ask us, what are you doing here?